the problem that we're going to look at, this is number 4 from the assignment that we worked on Tuesday. So this is looking at pea plants. And as it turns out, this is all real. This is actual stuff. I mentioned Gregor Mendel on Tuesday, and he was the one who first figured this out. Real, live, actual pea plants, like the kind of pea plants that grow the peas that we either eat or don't eat, depending on whether we like peas, can have peas that are round or peas that are wrinkled. And what Mendel discovered is that round peas are dominant over wrinkled peas. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us a couple of things. One is that we're looking at one gene here. And the gene, remember, the gene is a category, and it's a category that all organisms of this species will have. Not all peas are round, not all peas are wrinkled, but all peas have some sort of chemical in their cells that regulates their pea shape. Okay, so our gene is pea shape. All pea plants have a gene for pea shape. In fact, they all have 2. They have 2 homologous chromosomes. They each have the same gene for pea shape. They may have the same allele, or they may have different alleles. We have 2 different allele possibilities. One of the alleles will cause the peas to be round, and that is the dominant trait, and we'll use a capital R to abbreviate that, and we'll talk about what we mean by dominant in just a second. And the other allele is for wrinkled peas, and that's the recessive allele, and we'll use a lowercase r to indicate the presence of that allele. When we talk about dominant and recessive alleles, not always, but typically what we're talking about is the difference between a version of a gene that actually does something or a version of a gene that just really kind of doesn't do much at all. And that, at first glance, seems weird, because it seems like, well, wait a second. Doesn't the round pea allele make the pea round and the wrinkled pea allele make the pea wrinkled? That's not actually what's happening. What's actually happening is the peas are wrinkled to start with. Okay, peas have the tendency to be wrinkled. If the round pea allele is there, then the cells in that pea will produce all sorts of proteins and all sorts of other things that will both give the pea structure and cause the pea to retain water. So with the dominant allele present, the peas will change from being wrinkled to being round. But if there are no dominant alleles present, if there's no round pea allele there, then the pea just stays wrinkled. So the recessive allele doesn't make it wrinkled, it just doesn't change it. You can think about it the same way that we think about paper. So if you look at a sheet of paper, a paper starts out white. And you buy like plain paper from the store, it's white. Some paper has been colored, yellow or pink or blue, but it's not that the white paper was colored white and the colored paper was colored with yellow or pink or blue. It's that both sheets of paper started out white. If you don't add anything, it stays white. If you add yellow, then it turns yellow. That's what's happening with these dominant and recessive alleles. And in this case, what we're looking at is a pea shape that would just be wrinkled on its own. But if the round pea allele is there, it'll kind of pump it up, give it a little bit of structure and a little bit of water so that it's round instead of being wrinkled. The reason that it's dominant is because you don't need 2 copies of that allele. If it's there, it will produce the proteins that pump up the pea. And if it's not there, then there aren't any proteins, there aren't any things that will tend to pump that up. And as a result, we'd end up with peas that stay wrinkled. Yeah. Oh, so we're going to talk about that a little bit more down the road. But essentially, what happened is that it turns out that that organisms that have two copies of each gene and can potentially have two different alleles are effectively banking things that may not be helpful now, but might be helpful in the future. So, like, there's no real advantage to having round peas or wrinkled peas. It doesn't help you or hurt you. But in a changed environment, like in an environment where there's lots of humidity, like if climate change caused humidity levels to just soar and everywhere around the world it was like 100% humidity, then maybe it actually would be better for pea plants to have the wrinkled pea shape, because then they could absorb water from the air. I'm just making all this up, but it's that kind of thing. So, and that's what happens with humans too, is we sort of bank these recessive alleles that may or may not have like a utility now, but in 100,000 years or 500,000 years, there may arise environmental change that causes those things to actually be useful. But we'll talk about that more when we talk about evolution, because that's really where it comes together. So for now, what we're thinking about is they're just out there. We know they're out there, and we haven't quite figured out like why there's an advantage to having these recessive alleles in the background. Okay, so we've got our gene of pea shape. We've got our two alleles, one round allele, one wrinkled allele. Those are like specific sequences of DNA that code for specific proteins that have specific shapes. One of those proteins will tend to kind of inflate the pea and give it a little bit more shape and probably some water too. The other allele just really doesn't do anything at all, and so the pea stays wrinkled. We have two plants that we're looking at here, and we're performing what's called a cross. And in biology, when we talk about a cross, what we're talking about is when the biologist has control over which individuals produce offspring. So plants in nature like just reproduce, but in a lab, a biologist may say, I'm going to take some pollen from this plant and put it on the flower of this plant so that they reproduce. That's called a cross. Biologists do that with plants, and they do that with some other organisms as well. Fruit flies is the most common one used in labs around the world. So scientists essentially breed fruit flies in order to study genetics. So we've got two parent plants here. One is homozygous dominant. That means that the two homologous chromosomes and the two genes on those homologous chromosomes have the same allele. It has two copies of the dominant allele. And what I'm going to say, that we don't know which of these parent plants is female and which is male. And yeah, plants do have a female and a male. Male plants make pollen. The female plants make eggs. And pollen actually has sperm in it. So plants reproduce with sperm and eggs, just like animals do. So I'm just going to say there's no reason to assume one or the other, but I'm going to say that in this case, the male plant, this is the symbol for male. I'm going to say that the male plant is the homozygous dominant one. So during meiosis, the chromosomes, those homologous chromosomes, each of which has one dominant allele on it, will separate. And then those homologous chromosomes each consist of two sister chromatids. Those will separate, and we'll end up with 4 possible types of gametes. Each 4 of those possible types of gametes has the exact same allele on it because the parent cell had 2 copies of the exact same allele. So that means one of the gamete types is going to have a dominant allele, and the other gamete type is also going to have a dominant allele. Now, here's something kind of interesting to think about. These are indistinguishable from each other to us. We could not tell the difference between one of these dominant alleles and another one. But we actually have ways of marking. We have like come up with such clever ways of labeling things that it turns out we could, if we wanted to, put a radioactive isotope in one of these and a different radioactive isotope in the other one. We could radioactively label these. So we could say this one has a little like red radioactive isotope, and this one has a little green radioactive isotope. We wouldn't be able to see the difference, but with a device that measures radioactivity and measures the wavelength of the like gamma rays and stuff, we could determine which of these two alleles we were looking at. The female plant is homozygous for wrinkled peas. So that means the female plant also only has two different kinds of gametes that it's going to produce. They'll both have the same allele. They're not the exact same physical allele. They're just like identical. And so we could do the same thing with those. We could label them. We could put a little, the equivalent of a black dot of a radioactive isotope on one of those alleles, and the equivalent of a blue dot of a radioactive isotope on the other type of the allele. We're going to use this Punnett square to show all the different possible gamete combinations that these two parent plants could make. And one of the things that's really important to recognize is that we are not showing the 4 kids that these two plants will have. We could cross these two plants and end up with 1 offspring, or 3, or 7, or 1 million. We could cross these plants multiple times and generate thousands of offspring. The 4 possibilities that I'm about to write in this Punnett square do not represent actual individuals that will be born. They represent possible combinations of gametes. They're going to allow us to determine the likelihood of something happening. So for this box on the upper left, that represents the case where one of the dominant alleles from the male parent fuses with one of the recessive alleles from the female parent. In this case, the dominant allele is the one that we labeled with the little red dot, and the recessive allele is the one that we labeled with the black dot. In the box on the upper right, that represents the case where one of the dominant alleles from the male parent fuses with one of the recessive alleles from the female parent, but this time, the male parent's allele is the one that we labeled with the little green dot. The female parent's is still the one with the black dot. In the lower left-hand corner, we're going to have one dominant allele from the male parent and one recessive allele from the female parent. And in the lower right-hand corner, we're going to have the other dominant allele from the male parent and a recessive allele from the female parent. And again, if we label these, what we can see is that we're getting different alleles, like different physical alleles, even though they're identical in shape and sequence, and the resulting proteins are going to be identical in function. And if you look at the labeling, you'll see there's actually 4 different label possibilities: red and black, green and black, red and blue, green and blue. And that represents the 4 different ways that the parental alleles could combine during reproduction. The end result is all the same. Each one of these boxes is 25% likely to occur during any one individual mating event. But since they're all the same, we are going to end up seeing only one possible outcome from this mating. Every offspring that these two parent plants will have this genotype. It's going to be one dominant and one recessive allele. The other way that we can describe that genotype is with this word, heterozygous. So they will be 100% heterozygous, and they will all have the same appearance as well. The phenotype is all going to be round peas. And again, 100% of all the offspring will have that. Yeah. Heterozygous always means one dominant and one recessive allele. So there are some, and we'll see a couple of instances where things get a little bit more complicated, but in our simplest case, which is the one that we're going to kind of stick to, we're always going to have the same system. There's going to be one gene with two alleles. One allele will be dominant, one allele will be recessive. So that means for that simplest system, every time an individual is heterozygous, that individual will also have the dominant phenotype. Yeah. There's other kinds of systems where we have, say, multiple genes for a trait, or where a trait has more than two alleles, or where some of the alleles are partially dominant or co-dominant. And it gets a little trickier to figure out, but we're going to keep it simple for this. The other thing that I want you all to be able to think about is that in this case, we have these two parent organisms that look different. All of their offspring are going to look the same. But interestingly enough, if we were to take some of the offspring and cross them, which scientists do all the time, we would end up seeing something different. So if we were to take one of these heterozygous offspring, a male plant, and cross it with a heterozygous female plant, then a quarter of their offspring would be homozygous dominant and would show the dominant phenotype. Half of their offspring, on average, would be heterozygous and would show the dominant phenotype. And 1/4 of their offspring would be homozygous recessive and would show the recessive phenotype. So some of you were asking earlier this week, what about the thing where you skip generations? This is the thing where you skip generations. This is how it happens. If your grandparents or great-grandparents had a recessive trait and somebody inherited that recessive trait, but also had a dominant allele, then they would have had the dominant phenotype, and you don't necessarily know that they have that recessive allele in there. But eventually, if two people who both have one copy of the recessive allele have a baby, there's a chance, 25% chance, that that baby will have both recessive alleles. And that, I mean, that's explains it. That's why, for me, for example, my grandmother on my mother's side had light hair and blue eyes. My mom did not. My dad did not, but I do. So it skipped a generation. So my mom and dad must both have had the recessive alleles that cause blue-eyed, blonde-haired children. They're located on the same chromosome. That's why they're frequently linked together. That's why people with blonde hair usually have blue eyes, and people with blue eyes usually have blonde hair. They're located on the same chromosome, so they tend to stick together. And so this is one of the really cool things that Mendel figured out. He realized, oh, this explains it. This explains why we can have an entire field of pea plants that all make round peas. But if we cross a couple of those, their offspring might make wrinkled peas. That was one of the things that they were interested in. Before he did this, people thought that it was always sort of a blend, right? Like people thought that, well, if you have round peas and wrinkled peas, then your offspring are going to have sort of wrinkled peas. They just assumed that, right? And in some cases, that is the way it looks, because usually there's more than one gene that goes into a phenotype. But in certain cases, if it's one gene and there's only two alleles, we see this really clear, like you're either one or the other. And two parents that look one way can potentially have an offspring that looks different. So this is the level of explanation that I'm going to be expecting from you. You could see there's a lot that went into what I said. The things that you didn't know before, like we didn't talk about Gregor Mendel's specific experiments, so I don't expect you all to be able to talk about that. I didn't ask in the question for you to think about this second cross between the two recessive plants, but that is the kind of follow-up question that I might ask you, is something like, well, what would happen if you crossed this plant with this plant? The kinds of follow-up questions that I might ask might have something to do with, well, you know there's a difference between genes and alleles, but they're sort of related. In this case, what's the gene we're talking about? And what are the alleles that we're talking about? You would need to be able to explain that. If I asked you, what does the dominant allele do in this case? And what does the recessive allele do? You would need to be able to describe that. If you were to say here, the recessive allele makes the P wrinkled, that's not correct, right? Because all 4 of our heterozygous offspring have the recessive allele. None of them would have wrinkled P's. So that's not quite right. It's not that the recessive allele makes it wrinkled. It's that the recessive allele doesn't prevent it from being wrinkled. The dominant allele does prevent it from being wrinkled. So if you have the dominant allele, either 1 or 2 copies, you'll have round P's. If you don't have the dominant allele, though, then you basically got nothing. And you're going to end up with the wrinkled P.